rich man had a steward who was reported to him for squandering his property. He summoned him and said, "What is this I hear about you? Prepare a full account of your stewardship, because you can no longer be my steward." The steward said to himself, "What shall I do now that my master is taking the position of steward away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do so that when I am removed from the stewardship, they may welcome me into their homes." He called in his master's debtors one by one. To the first he said, "How much do you owe my master?" He replied, 100 measures of olive oil." He said to him, "Here is your promissory note. Sit down and quickly write one for 50. Then to another the steward said, "And you, how much do you owe?" He replied, 100 cores of wheat. The steward said to him, "Here is your promissory note. Write one for 80. And the master commended that dishonest steward for acting prudently. For the children of this world are more prudent in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. I tell you, make friends for yourselves with dishonest wealth, so that when it fails, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. The person who is trustworthy with very small matters is also trustworthy in great ones, and the person who is dishonest in very small matters is also dishonest in great ones. If therefore you are not trustworthy with dishonest wealth, who will trust you with true wealth? If you are not trustworthy with what belongs to another, who will give you what is yours? No servant can serve two masters. He will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon. The Gospel of the Lord. Many years ago, over 35, a friend of mine had a child who got in a little trouble at school. Now I know what you're thinking. The story is all about a friend's situation. Then it's always followed by something like, "It definitely was not any of my children." This child was offering her friendship in exchange for quarters. She was about 5 or 6 at the time. Of course, my friend's child needed to be taught a few lessons about true friendship and appropriate behavior. But I could not deny her cleverness and entrepreneurship. In the course of the lesson, the child decided that she needed to repay all those quarters, which would definitely lighten her piggy bank, but also wanted to make things right with her friends. The gospel passage today is part of a series of parables dealing with spiritual crises that are generated when we misuse our possessions, when we end up being possessed by our possessions. Last Sunday's gospel was about the prodigal son, who demanded his share of his father's estate and then went out and squandered it all. The lesson today involves, as you know, the devious and clever steward who doctors the accounts of the master's books in order to win friends who will care for him as he faces his impending firing. Today's parable needs to be understood with the realization that it was against Jewish law to charge interest on loans of money. Instead of bankers, many Jews earned interest by lending out produce instead of money. In this particular case, the rich man may have been an absentee landlord who loaned olive oil and wheat to his debtors, expecting to receive more of each commodity in return than what he loaned them, the difference being the equivalent of interest charges on his loans. It was understood that the master steward would also earn a commission out of the different amount, the amount between what was borrowed and what was to be paid back. The religious understanding of the Pharisees was a very meticulous spiritual bookkeeping exercise. Everyone had to pray, pay, and obey. Anyone who didn't was considered to be a lawbreaker and was cast out. Everything had its price, and everyone had their value in the spiritual economy. Jesus had a different understanding of our value in God's eyes. What must have scandalized the Pharisees was the realization that the foresightful steward in today's parable was being praised by Jesus precisely for his prudent vision and what lay ahead of him, not because he was a cheat, but because he was a sinner who dared to hope for redemption. Jesus is not commending the steward's dishonesty. The steward's dishonesty was discovered and obvious to everyone. Jesus didn't concern himself with the obvious. The prodigal son squandered his money, and the steward squandered his master's property. Both, however, took the necessary steps to secure their futures, just as did the people presented in similar parables that Jesus used. What Jesus is concerned with is the lack of spiritual foresight on the part of his followers. The point Jesus is making is that we all ought to be foresightful and prudent in planning ahead for our spiritual futures, as the worldly wise are in planning ahead for their financial and material futures. Jesus clearly is not commending the wicked steward for his deviousness. He was, after all, establishing a conspiracy to defraud the owner of the interest of his loans, while at the same time returning the master's principal amount on his loans, making friends with his master's debtors, and securing his own future along the way. Jesus was presenting his followers with an example of the zealous foresightfulness of the wicked steward, and wishing that his own followers would at least be as enterprising and caring for their future of their souls. And so the immediate question confronting you and me is, how zealous are we in providing for our spiritual futures? Is it my unspoken assumption that what I do or what I don't do in life really doesn't matter in the long run because a loving and infinitely merciful God will provide for me anyway? Many charitable and service organizations have mission statements. Most parishes have them. Successful businesses all have business plans. And people who work in them, executives and workers alike, from time to time need to examine what they're doing in the light of those plans and statements in order to keep focused and not devote their energies and divert them from their goals. The world is filled with distractions. At times we get so busy and we wonder what we are accomplishing and where we are going. There are consequences that flow from our decisions and consequences that flow from our non-decisions and neglect. When you stop and think about it, not to decide is a decision in itself. It can be a neglectful decision and have very bad consequences for us. This is also the case when it comes to our spiritual lives. So, what do we do in our own futures, our own spiritual futures? Can we accept the fact that we are sinners who can be much like the steward in today's parable, sinners who dare to hope, a prodigal son who returns home believing in his father's love? It's a question of faith. It's a question of hope. It's a question of love. What steps are we taking to provide for our spiritual futures? One way that we can do this is by making a retreat. It may be that a retreat isn't something that is just simply nice to do. It may be very necessary for us to do it. Time alone with God is essential if we are to spend eternity with God forever in heaven. We all have a destiny God has given us. God didn't give you and me a life to be lived only until we die. God gave us a life that he wants to share with us for all eternity, an eternal life to be lived in love and in love relationship between you and him. That, it seems to me, is the point for today's parable and why Jesus is commending the foresightful steward to our attention. My prayer for us today is that we take the time to spend with God and do the things that will provide for our spiritual futures.